The Wanderer by Fritz Leiber.
And my name is Leiber.
Oops, sorry. The Wanderer by Fritz Leiber. Alright, so this book is copyright 1964, and Fritz won the Hugo Award in 1965 with this one for Best Novel. Now, this video review will go into a little bit of spoiler territory, but I'd like to say first off that I don't really recommend this book to many people. There may be a few people out there that want to read this, but overall I wouldn't recommend it. And so if this is on your TBR, if this was a book that you've kind of always wanted to check out, you probably don't want to watch this video unless you're okay with just a light amount of spoilers. So let's get into the plot of this book. I can summarize the plot pretty quick. The most interesting thing, and when I say interesting, it definitely has its pros and cons, is the narrative style. And so I'll get into that too, and then go through the rest of what I normally do. So the plot of this book, it takes place on Earth, kind of in the near future of 1965 or mid-60s. And everyone on Earth has kind of got their eyes to the skies because there's going to be this lunar eclipse. We also have people out in space. We have 4 American astronauts that are on the moon at the time. And as people are looking up towards the sky, they start to notice some weird anomalies around the moon and around the solar system. And then, kind of as this lunar eclipse is taking place, this enormous planet appears right next to the moon. And this planet starts exerting its gravitational forces on the Earth, and then even more so on the moon. And it ends up crushing the moon, sucking it into its gravitational sphere and kind of absorbing it. And on the planet Earth, it starts affecting the tides first, and each tide gets stronger and stronger, and we start to see issues with earthquakes and volcanoes as the gravitational force starts acting on the plates. And so we get this really apocalyptic scene on Earth where people really don't know what's going on. They can see this planet, and it's just wreaking havoc on Earth. Now this planet also, it looks completely round to everybody, and it has these patterns that form on it, and they're like yellow and purple. And throughout the book, as it goes through different phases, let me see if I can find an example. Fritz drew little pictures of how the yellow and purple patterns appear on the surface of this new planet as it's kind of rotating and moving around. And so there's a mystery of kind of what's going on there. Our astronauts are kind of in trouble and have issues there as the moon's getting sucked into the planet. And towards the end of the book, this is where we get into a little spoilerish territory. I think a little over halfway, we kind of get introduced to these aliens that are kind of piloting this planet in and out of hyperspace. So they're able to travel faster than the speed of light, and they can move around the universe, and we kind of get to find out that they're being chased by what we're not sure at first, and then that thing ends up kind of finding them, and then they disappear, and we're kind of left with Earth in this kind of chaotic state, kind of a post-apocalyptic Earth with no moon left either. And that's kind of how it's left. There's not a lot of plot resolution on these aliens and these planets, and that's kind of a summary of the plot. Now, the narrative structure is something I'm used to. I've read these stories that try to tell a story by, disassociated groups of people from different points of view that really don't have anything to do with one another, but they're overall kind of giving you an idea of, like in this case, the chaos that's happening on the planet. Now the problem is that I had, and we're already getting into some cons, but there's not really main characters. There's the closest thing to some main characters is probably these three people, and it's kind of a love triangle between a woman and two men. One of the men is an astronaut that's up on the surface of the moon, and the other two are down on Earth, and they kind of meet up with this group of UFO researcher symposium kind of people, and they were kind of getting together for, I think, to watch the lunar eclipse, but they kind of get sucked up with them. There's kind of some weird things that happen there. And then you have these other plot lines, like in New York, you have some people that are just kind of hiding out in a high-rise, moving up the floors as the water levels are rising. Also in New York, there's these three stoners who are just going around smoking pot and kind of trying to figure out what's going on. In, I think, Florida, there's this lady who's getting spied on while she's sunbathing, and she ends up meeting the guy who is spying on her, and he ends up being this Klansman. I kid you not. You've got some guy who's just floating around in the Atlantic Ocean who kind of doesn't know what's going on because he's on the water anyways. You got some people wandering around England randomly. And then you got some people down in this kind of bunker. They're like mission control for these astronauts. And they have a whole nother weird kind of side plot. So, and then there's more beyond that. And then there's just these little, data dumps just dropped in here and there too, where Fritz is just kind of explaining what's going on, not by the point of view of any of the characters, but just more of an omniscient summary of some things that are happening. And so that's how this story is told. And we'll get into more of that in the pros and cons. So I guess let's just go into pros and cons. For pros, some of the ideas of the science were interesting, but they weren't really well explained, especially when it came to these planets, where at one point the alien kind of does a data dump and gives his big speech to some of our characters and kind of explains what's going on with them, but we don't get the whole story there. I would say the biggest pro for me is how he described the gravitational forces on Earth, how people kind of figure out that these forces start getting stronger and stronger, so the tides kept getting higher and lower. And so the smart ones figure this out and how they try to get around this and try to survive. And some of the earthquakes and, all the way he described the gravitational force on Earth was done pretty well. And now let's get into the cons. So the narrative structure, while could have been done well, I liked the idea of it. I just don't think in a 300 and some odd page book he had the time to really get you invested in the characters. And then you kind of were waiting for maybe some of these plot lines to converge, like I've seen in other books done, but pretty early on you realize that these plot lines aren't going to converge. They're just trying to paint the picture of what's going on the planet. And with that, you don't really care about these characters. It's just a way of him describing kind of what's happening to different people around the planet. Now, one of the biggest cons is this book did not age very well with some of its themes and especially the dialogue. It's just really dated. There's parts of this that are racist, sexist. There's a scene that started to get really rapey until the woman decided to kind of go along with it. There's just a lot of things that just didn't age well. I can read these things. I try to keep an open mind about when it was written and this and that, but to me, a lot of it didn't really serve too much of the plot. I don't know why it was in there. Kind of wonder what Fritz was on at the time, but it's going to be tough for a lot of people to try to read it on that level. And that's probably the biggest reason I wouldn't recommend this book. So really, I don't really recommend this to many people unless you're just trying to read all the books on the Hugo list, or maybe you just really love Fritz's writing. And from what I can tell, this is a little different than a lot of the other books he did. All right, so let's get into what I'm going to read next. Maybe I'm a glutton for punishment, but I had gone through and put all the Goodreads scores in this list of books that I'm doing, this series, Masterpieces of Science Fiction. And the lowest book on this list of 140 books is They'd Rather Be Right by Mark Clifton and Frank Riley. And so I'm going to give this an attempt. Maybe just get 2 stinkers out of the way. I might try to pick off some of the kind of worst books, or the books that I think I'm not going to like the most now, and try to kind of build up a little momentum and steam as I get into the latter half of this series that I'm doing. So that's it for this video, and thanks for watching.